Margvelashvili, we have the Speaker of the Parliament, and then we have two additional speakers. We have from the opposition, Mr. David Bakradze, and then we have my old friend and colleague, Dr. Gia Nodia. So I guess everybody should speak for about 10 minutes, and then we will open up the discussion to the audience for questions. I guess everybody would like to speak from their places, so we'll begin with the President. So, Mr. President, please take the floor.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Fukuyama. I think we are in a stage of discussing some of the most problematic areas and issues of our national development and building democracy in Georgia. We had extensive introductions describing generally the state of our statehood and the history that we have gone through. I think that this is always important to go back to the roots, the essentials from which we were starting and where we are. So, to put it briefly, we can say that, and this word has been used a couple of times today, the term of consolidated democracy. And I think that 3 consecutive democratic elections through which we had a peaceful change of power, which were the elections in the parliament, the elections of the president, the elections in the local government, have significantly showed that Georgian society has agreed that the change of the government, change of the power in this nation is happening through elections, and this is a legitimate process for developing, for formalizing your governance, your national and local authorities, and this is very important, not only externally, but also very important internally, because I believe, especially with the last elections on local government, where we had second runs, the society have definitely seen and experienced that the voter, the individual participation of voter is what really changes the outcome of election, and that it is dependent on each and every citizen what political system will be established in the nation. So one of important and significant achievements is, I would say, consolidated democracy, which we have right now in Georgia. And of course, and I'm referring to my colleague, the chairman of the parliament, of course, this is not final, and it has to be sustained, but I guess any state in democracy has to be sustained. It is never finally achieved, and you have always to fight for it and to be careful to reach this level. But anyway, I think that the consolidation of democracy has happened, and the importance of the electoral process as a process through which the governance is changed has been set up, and it has become a culture, a political culture of our nation. The second very important part of our condition of where we are right now is the state of our economy, and the problems of our economy which we are facing and which have been traditionally part of our development since the break of Soviet Union. I mean, in Soviet Union, in a very unrealistic economic environment, Georgia very often had a very favorable conditions. But after the breakup of the Soviet Union, we have been the nation that has been experiencing severely some of the most problematic economic breakdowns. We are having now a reality where economy is growing. Fortunately, the economy this year is improving significantly. We have an economic growth of 6%, where it was estimated that it would be 5%. We have it estimated 6%, and possibly to the end of the year, this will be the outcome of the growth of Georgian economy. At the same time, we have traditional problems of distribution of the small wealth that we have in our nation, as well as of the potential of the growth. Our index of the distribution of wealth among society, creation of jobs, possibilities for medium and small business are unfortunately very poor, and this is one of the significant realities which we are facing. This reality is not only economic, and this reality is part of the political and social environment in which we live. Because any kind of reforms that are going to be taken, any kind of developments that should be happening in our nation, they are very strongly dependent on the possibility of society, the economic possibility of society to go through these reforms. And as I told you, the percentage of the distribution of wealth among different strata of our society is still very poor and insignificant. And though there is economic growth, it does not always reflect on concrete families and on concrete lives of ordinary citizens. It is a challenge for this government to develop not only a budget that is oriented towards social needs and that is oriented on an individual citizen, but it is also a challenge for us to develop a system that will create a better distribution of wealth in our nation, and that is going to be a significant part of social stability for us. Another issue that we are facing right now is, of course, the factor of our international context in which we are developing and which we are a part of. We are trying to share with our colleagues the fact that the events that took place in 2008, let's not go into details what was happening concretely in every day and every hour, but overall the events that were happening in August of 2008 and the events that are happening right now in Ukraine are the part of the same concept. A concept which we did not discover, a concept that is very widely spoken out. It is described as a geopolitical concept, it is described as a concept of special interest zones, and you don't have to be really an outstanding scholar like many of you are here to just listen very carefully to the messages that are coming from some of the politicians of Russian Federation, that they view part of the ex-Soviet Union, even in some cases the borders of the ex-Russian Empire, as a sphere of special interest zones, and they develop international policy in direction to those areas as a separate, with a separate logic of, let's say, with a separate favorable, some kind of separate favorable for Russia logic of communication. And Georgia is part of, not only part of this zone, but Georgia is part of the first military activities in the area of this zone. Now, what we are witnessing with our partners and colleagues and with our allies is often reaction from case-to-case basis to the events that are happening in this zone, in the zone of ex-Soviet Union. In 2008, there is a reaction that stops the war in Georgia, that stops the bloodshed, but does not resolve the conflict during the 6 years, and there is no positive development except the non-recognition policy, which we very strongly support, but there is no step forward to go to the status of pre-2008 events. In 2014, we witnessed the same. First, there was reactions on Crimea. Now there are reactions on Donetsk. In future, we might find other cases to react to. But I believe that the reaction should be not locally from case to case, but the reaction should be globally to the whole attitude that free nations, that emerged after the destruction of Soviet Union are as free and are as and should be enjoying freedom and protection from their allies, as well as the rights that are, as well as the logic of international relations and the logic of communications, like any other countries in the world. And the humankind should not accept some kind of twisted international context in the areas of ex-Soviet Union. If we are going to tolerate this and discuss this from case-to-case basis, we'll have case-to-case problems to discuss, whereas I believe there should be a global attitude to the whole area. Anyway, Georgia is part of this reality. Georgia is a part of Georgia in developing its statehood and developing its democracy is a part. Is trying to build its identity, to build its nation with occupied territories and with problems that are emerging on a daily basis on the borders of these territories. And finally, we are a nation that is trying to build new identity, new European identity, not as a part, new European identity in a very interesting cultural / political context. On one hand, and I've mentioned this many times, I believe that individually Georgians as well as Georgian culture is definitely oriented and a part of European culture, is a part of the same values that have been developed in Europe. On the other hand, we do often lack some of traditions, not on personal, not on individual, not on, let's say, social, but on the state level. We lack some of the traditions through which the Europe has been functioning and the traditions in which European statehood has been developing. So right now we are challenged on one hand with our natural, individual and cultural Europeanism being a part of the same civilization. On the other hand, with often lack of the state traditions to put this into a functioning day-to-day format, and sometimes it takes many years not to create the institutions, but to create the tradition which operate those institutions. And and in this respect, we see that the society is gradually growing. It is establishing some of the basic of traditions, which is actually the trust to election, the accountability of government, the separation and independence of power, and we are in the process of establishing those traditions at the same time. So to put it all together, I believe we have gone through a very complicated and recent history that my friend has mentioned has gone through many crashes and many problems like civil wars, like devastated the economy, but at the same time we have achieved a level of social development, we have achieved a level of development of civil society, we have achieved a level of establishment of some of the basics of democratic institutions that has a great potential and has a great future and has a great potential not only for Georgia, but has a great potential for the overall region. I want to emphasize on this because I believe Georgia is playing a significant role in linking some of very interesting economic energy resources of Asia with potentials of Europe, and also that means being very fruitful partner for Azerbaijan, for Kazakhstan, for Turkmenistan, for the countries of the Caspian Basin. Also, that means being a partner for European countries. But I believe Georgia has a great message to be sent to Russia as well, to Russian Federation. The paradigm that we have been trying to push is that peaceful, stable, economically prosperous, Georgia as a southern neighbor for Russian Federation is definitely a benefit for Russia as a nation and for Russians as individuals and citizens, which will find their potential to be partnering here, which will find potential of developing business, and which will have much more safer environment on their southern borders. I know that the message does not run through very effectively to Kremlin, but I believe that eventually this will happen. And Georgia, as a part of the region which should be sending message of positive and economic development and cultural development, will be a significant player in developing this region as a peaceful region, and will not have continuous problems arising from Caucasus. I believe that in this context, stable economic development of Georgia is beneficial for any of its neighbors, and that's where we are going. And democratic stability and development of our nation is a presupposition for building a state like that. I'm staying here together with you, and I'm interested in answering questions and in engaging in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fukuyama. Dear guests, I guess you just saw Georgian parliamentary democracy in action. Even the president of Georgia is asking to the speaker of the parliament how much time he has left for his speech. Thank you, Mr. President, for your very well-done analysis of the challenges of Georgian statehood and the process of building of the state. But the topic is so important that probably some other elements could be added to whatever was already said. And I'll try to address this issue in three different aspects, kind of historical, geopolitical, and ideological, because all these aspects are so important for this process, which we now are calling a state-building process. Obviously, building a state is much more different and much more complex task than building of a building. And well, it is quite possible to build 100-story high skyscraper modeled as Manhattan building in Tbilisi. Just you need some engineers and financing. But for building good, well-functioning modern state in Georgia or any other countries, it is not enough to have resources like money, advisors, books, scholars, and so on, because the state is much more complex feature than any other institution. And for this reason, when we mention this word state, we mean democratic institutions which are functioning in order to make the services to the people as it is understood in the 21st century. However, the historic aspect is very important, because when we think or when we speak about Georgian state, usually Georgians are immediately going to the history, and we are proud to let to the world that we had our statehood for at least 2,000 years. And our state was prosperous in the region and was dictating even politics to big powers in the region, and so on and so on. However, all these historical things give not much when we talk about the modern statehood. And the problem of Georgian state in historical perspective is the period of last 200 years, when Georgia was not an independent state, and when Georgia was out of the process of building of modern states as we know this thing in Europe or elsewhere. I will not go, of course, in deep and detailed analysis of the things, but I want to underline one important aspect, which is frequently forgotten by international scholars and even by Georgians. What we were doing about 30 years ago in this country? What was the process there? And about 30 years ago, I was a law student in Tbilisi State University Law Department. And as a lawyer, we were specialists of the state and the law. And for 2 years, we were taught Marxist-Leninist theory of the state. And the cornerstone of that theory was that during the communism era, state will disappear. So while making progress in the building of communism, the state as institution was becoming less and less necessary, and it would disappear. I do not recommend to go and read that work of Lenin, which he did, I guess, in 1918 or so. And this work was called State and Power. But law students in Georgian universities were just reading that book and making all the quotations from there and so on. And again, the understanding was that during communism, and Nadia will, I guess, contribute to that as well. He knows much more about that from philosophical approach. During the communism, rules would not be necessary. Law enforcement as such would not be necessary. And state will not be necessary because we all would live in harmony. There will be no wars. We will understand each other, proletariat, and so on and so on. There would be no money. There would be no private property. There would be nothing to protect, and so on and so on.
It's like John Lennon.
Yeah, now these things are a matter of joke or fun, but it was serious thing. And when we are talking about the building modern states in the space of former communist empire, we need to understand that the foundation here, in mentality of the society, of the people, comes from this past. And that was not 200 years ago, that was 2-3 decades ago. And such things are not disappearing with the orders or with declarations when we announced our independence, or when we put in the constitution that, well, we are building something different, when we are basing our state system on the principles of separation of power and rule of law. These are nice words, but they do not change the reality in one day or in 1 year or even during 1 decade. And this is important thing we need to understand. What was the philosophy of the state? Because, well, Lenin thought that in 2-3 years the world will become communist, then the state will disappear sooner. But then Stalin had to invent new theory, which was that, yeah, we need the state until the revolution will win in the other countries as well. And that was the state of dictatura or proletariat or whatever, state of dictatorship. So these concepts, including very deeply rooted concept in post-Soviet societies, concept of democratic centralism, which is the concept of military order. Democratic centralism, of course, the word democratic is camouflage, but the main thing is centralism, which means that everybody who has one more star here is higher boss for everybody who has one less star here. And that was applied to state administration as well. That's why, and that's how this concept of authoritarian ruling as only possible, viable system of governance was rooted in our societies and in our mentality. I was among those who thought that such problems would disappear sooner than later. But it appeared, and Georgian history demonstrates that, and I'm not talking about the developments in some other countries in the neighborhood, which demonstrates this trend even better, that such things never disappeared. And every government needs to apply special efforts to these things. And we should not take anything as granted. And the certain key issues, key aspects of modern statehood must be in priority in the agenda of every single government. And if I'm asked why the governments before in Georgia, Gamsakhulia's government, Shevardnadze's government, Saakashvili's government failed, number one reason I believe was that all of them excluded this aspect from their agenda. And there were different approaches to the understanding what was going on, but that was more than clear that the building of democratic statehood was not top priority, because they all believed that it is already done and now we are going to do different reforms, and we have already these mechanisms and these instruments and tools for doing those policy reforms. Well, time does not permit to go in deep on this aspect, but we can come back on that. The second very important issue, the geopolitical, international aspect of the state building. It was already mentioned several times this morning that, well, there is a big power in our neighborhood who just does not want to take this reality. And everything what they are doing since early 90s is designed in order to not to allow people of Georgia to build their own independent state. And then, yeah, I guess there's no need to talk much about the consequences. It's not about territory only, which is now under control of Russia. It is the current political process in the international arena. In this very difficult momentum, not only for Ukrainians, not only for Ukraine, not only for Georgians, but for the world system. At the moment, after tomorrow, NATO summit is going to tell to Georgia that yes, we are good boys in general, but probably it's not yet right circumstances around the world to grant us the map. Why? I don't know who is here from the press. It's not for the press, but it's not a secret. Anyway, we all know what's the reason. And the reason is called Russia. The state, which is the number one problem in the region and in the world, is still able to dictate the agenda and policy decisions of the most powerful institution in the world. Because there is no other reason not to make this step, other than this cynical, narrowly defined realism from Mr. Putin, which sometimes is answered by the same approach from the other part, because of number of reasons. And in these geopolitical circumstances, in these international circumstances, to think about this very nice process of state building and modernization of Georgia and other countries, well, is very difficult. It's very difficult because the main features of the statehood are not guaranteed. Sovereignty, territory, the world order, which is based on principles of international law and so on. Unfortunately, this issue was one of the most important things which occupied minds of every single Georgian government. And we are spending and are spending a lot of resources in this direction for ensuring security, for ensuring the existence. When previous government was able to increase budget revenues 10 times or so during 9 years, that was a remarkable achievement. But we should not forget that about 25% of that budgetary resources were going for defense, which appeared to be completely meaningless in the war with Russia when it came to as fact. So the nation which has, I don't know, every second person unemployed and in poverty had to spend 25% of its budget revenue for defense, which again appear to be not effective, and it could not be effective if it is confronted with such superpower as Russia. So, and we can understand all the other implications, political, financial, economic, and everything else, which is a huge constraint for modern state building process. And the ideological aspect, the third one, which is, of course, most important in these days. And we should not forget that we are living and we are conducting this conference in a time period when the leader of one of the European Union countries declares openly that the era of liberal democratic state is over, and probably it's better to build something different. I'm talking about Hungary. And illiberal states are achieving better results, namely Turkey, Russia, China, and so on. And he's thinking to turn his country to such direction. And this is happening in Central Europe. So this ideology of liberal democracy as such, which seems to be kind of, if not last, at least final destination at the moment of the civilization, is questioned everywhere. If we look in the world, I'm not talking about things which we witness in Iraq and in Syria and then in some other countries and so on. So this is huge thing. What kind of state we are building? And what, for example, the concept of rule of law means for Georgian decision makers, people, elites, and Armenians and Ukrainians and so on and so on. Well, unfortunately, I'm finding more frequently than I expected that the concept of rule of law means law of the ruler in most critical moments. And this understanding of the concept comes partly from communist past, but it's not communism only who should be blamed for such understanding of the situation. The problem is that living within the liberal democratic state does not change the nature of a human. And we frequently make such mistake. We believe that if we were able to live in accordance to the principles of liberal democracy for some time, where we are already such better humans that we can dictate our rules to the others, because we are already good people. Unfortunately, that was the process which happened in this country during the last few years, when people who were talking on the same language with the then opposition, now the government, then we realized that, well, we do not understand each other. And my friends who are here in this room, they were kind of ironically criticizing me, who was telling to them that democracy is about procedures. And I was calling for procedural democracy, and my friends would tell me, well, your procedural democracy cannot lead this country far. We need fast reforms. We do not have time for lengthy parliamentary discussions. We do not have time for free media or self-governance system, because we need fast modernization. And they were telling that, well, we are building the state, and you are telling us that the rights of one person in the prison or on the street is violated. And for that we need to sacrifice with such an effective minister? No, come on. These are just consequences which you cannot avoid. I believe this is very good lesson for everybody. First of all, for the new government, for us who are now in charge of this country and the majority in the parliament and so on. We saw that if you tolerate such things, if you sacrifice the so-called procedural democracy, if you tell that the rights of one human or 3 persons or one small opposition party is not such an important thing when you are achieving GDP growth or rate, or I don't know, budget revenue, or building new roads and so on. That everything will go fine. That's a huge mistake. I believe we need to do everything possible in order to strengthen the understanding of the rule of law in the society and in the political elites, and that's not the case yet. This is biggest challenge, I believe, for this country and for other countries around. Because unlike from 20 years ago, when we lacked the knowledge, when we started writing the constitution of independent Georgia, then I was young teacher at the university, and I asked to my students to write their thesis in that class and translate the constitutions from other countries, because we did not have in Georgian language even the text of the constitution of democratic countries. And that's how we started the very first constitutional commission. Now we have enough information and knowledge. We have people who were educated in the US, who were trained here in local universities. So knowledge is here, information is here. The mood of the people is more than clear. What they want European future. They want NATO as security protection, and not only as something which is so desired for the people. So what is left? To be clear about the principles and about the ideology and about the rule of law, first of all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's indeed a pleasure to be here and to address such a distinguished audience. And I think, Dr. Fukuyama, you will discover the positive difference between opposition and government simply by pronouncing my name, which is much shorter and easier to pronounce the names of the gentlemen. So with this positive note, let me start my introduction about Georgia's statehood and state building. And indeed, this country can truly serve as a case study for the state building, because in the last 25 years we have passed all possible stages of how state should or should not be built. So immediately after the dissolution of Soviet Union, when Georgia was on the front line of fighting for its independence and fighting against the Soviet Union, we got a state which by classical definition is hard to call a state because of lack of experience, because of lack of institutions, because of very hard environment around the country, because of the fact that we simply fell in all the traps which were typical traps for all post-Soviet countries, except maybe the Baltic states. And here, first of all, I mean ethnic tensions and nationalism. And when talking about ethnic tensions and ethnic conflicts in Georgia, one should understand that these ethnic issues are very closely related to political ones, and how basically the ethnic conflicts initiated in Georgia back in early 90s, it was merely political but not ethnic. Because I remember when Georgians had a referendum on independence, we had South Ossetia and Abkhazia, those days still or again controlled by Russia, saying that if Georgians want to separate from Soviet Union, we want to remain in Soviet Union. And I remember that ethnic demonstrations in Skhin Valley started around Lenin's statue. So Lenin's statue for them was a symbol of their belonging to that space, Soviet Union and Communist Party. And I remember, and we Georgians in this hall certainly remember how it started. So talking about ethnic conflicts in Georgia, this is the specifics of ethnic conflicts in Georgia, that they all started in very close relation to political issues, because when Georgia was striving for its independence, these regions were striving for remaining in Soviet Union. So this was a very typical trap for post-Soviet countries in that times when Soviet Union was about to dissolve, and it was a big chaos in this space. So these were the first elements of Georgian statehood, very weak, but still this was a very important stage because the Georgian state was announced. and Georgian state was declared officially, and that was a very important legacy of those few years. Then we had another period of rule of President Shevardnadze when he started some promising reforms, and he laid a foundation to many state institutions, including the parliament as well, including first free elections, multi-party elections. I mean, many positive things started, and that were important years for Georgian statehood. Then we had last 3 years of President Shevardnadze, which were disastrous for Georgian statehood in a sense that Georgia very quickly moved to all classical symptoms of the failed state. And there I mean inability of the state to provide its citizens with the basic services and goods. And the most notorious example of that is the blackouts and shortage of electricity in this country, where certain regions and even the capital Tbilisi were left without electricity supply for weeks and weeks and sometimes for months. And that's the most notorious example of state not being able to provide citizens with simple services. The corruption, which was very widespread, and it was way of life, and for some Georgians it became even a symbol of Georgian traditional values, that if you are Georgian, you should know how to pay a bribe in a nice way. And that's part of being good Georgian, that you can pay a bribe in a nice way. I mean, of course, Georgians are not more corrupt than, Americans or Italians or Norwegians. We are all human, we are all the same, but that was part of the system and that was part of the legacy. So the corruption was so widespread that it became a social phenomenon in this country. Crime and criminality, and that was, Georgia was basically, unfortunately, a criminal state where leaders of organized criminality were the persons who enjoyed all the privileges in the country, and we had thieves-in-law, leaders of organized crime, who, upon arrival in the Tbilisi airport, were met by Georgian ministers or deputy ministers and were conveyed by them to the city. And it was a big honor, not for criminal leaders, but for the deputy ministers to meet a criminal leader at the airport. So we had this kind of country, and unfortunately in those last 3 years of Shevardnadze's rule, country moved very close to the very edge of being a failed state, corrupt, dysfunctional, without an ability to provide the basic needs and basic services to the people. Then was the Rose Revolution, and then came the famous Bloody 9 years, which in my understanding and in my assessment were the years of setting up and building the real foundation of modern and functional state in Georgia. And some of the elements of it had been already mentioned, and I'm glad that at least in front of this international audience, these elements are not ignored and are mentioned. So I can repeat with pride and pleasure that the shadow economy in Georgia, which was a widespread problem because of corruption, the shadow economy had been decreased dramatically, and Georgian state budget increased more than 10 times in 9 years. Yes, we had economic growth, but no economic growth explains tenfold increase of budget in 9 years. It's impossible. The reason to that was that corruption was eliminated, and the money which used to go to pockets before, this money was going to budget and state treasury. So that's the reason why budget was increased 10 times. From one of the most corrupt states in post-Soviet space, which is per se known as one of the most corrupt area, but Georgia was the leader in the most corrupt area in terms of corruption. We turned into one of the least corrupt European states, and that's proved by Transparency International's corruption barometer, where Georgia is among those 20 or 25 countries where less than 6% of people had to pay a bribe annually. And this is the top group of people of countries, the least corrupt countries in the world. The trust into institutions had increased dramatically. Like in 2003, public trust into police was about 5–6%. And in 2011 and 2012, public trust to police was up to 85–90%. And that indicates how much the institutions have changed. And another good indicator is that trust to institutions was always in these years, only those years, was always much higher than trust to personalities or leaders of those institutions. Like, for example, the trust to police was always higher than trust to Minister of Interior. And that to me is a very good sign that it was trust to institutions, not to personalities. In terms of doing business, Georgia was number 132 in the World Bank rating, and we moved up to number 9. And that was an incredible change, indicating how much the environment and legislation has changed in the country. So I think these are all elements demonstrating that from failed state, which was unable to provide people with electricity or public transport or any basic services, Georgia moved and was transformed into a state. Yes, of course, not effective, not established, still state under transition, still state under development, but the trajectory of the state building was right. People may argue that sacrifice to all these fast reforms was the shortcomings in democracy, and that was mentioned by David Usupashvili. Yes, I can take part of this criticism and we can argue on this, but at the end of the day, the critical test of the system was the parliamentary elections in 2012, when the system was able to secure the peaceful transfer of power. And to me, that's the biggest practical test for any democratic system. If system allows peaceful transfer of power through elections, this democracy is functional. So despite all the shortcomings, despite all the issues which we may discuss about problems of democracy in Georgia in previous years, we passed the final test that Georgian democracy was able to change the government through peaceful elections, full stop. So to me, that means that the system which we created in the last 9 years, despite all the deficiencies, was still an effective system. Now, let me move to present days and the problems which I see today. And one of the problems seen from the viewpoint of state building is weakening and attacking the institutions. What we see today is an attempt to comprehensively revise the past. I mean, in any democracy, it's very legitimate that the new government attacks the previous government and attacks legacy by saying that I got a disastrous legacy from previous government, so now I should improve things. It's very legitimate debate for any democracy. But what happens here in Georgia is that this is not the way it happens in normal democracies. But by revising the past, basically, the government also attacks some of the institutional legacy which should be preserved and not attacked. To be more precise, I can bring for you, first of all, the scholars who are visiting Georgia, an example that you will visit Georgian Public Service Hall the day after tomorrow, and you will see it's a very good thing. It's a place, single window principle, where Georgian citizens can get any legal service moving to one single window without corruption, without delay, without moving to different bureaucrats. I mean, it's a very good practical know-how how to provide people with services. You will see it yourself in 2 days' time. And when the new government came after elections, in the attempt to criticize what was done in the past, they also attacked these public service halls, and the initial intention was to close these service institutions at all. I'm glad that it changed. I'm glad that now this government is talking about sharing experience with Albanians, for example, how to build and develop public service halls. I'm glad that they are doing that. But how it started was criticizing, saying that it's too much luxury for a country like Georgia to have public service halls like that. Another example which I may bring to you, and it's not only about the past and revising the past, but it's also revising the present. And presence of Mr. President reminds me that it's also attacking the institutions in present, not only in the past. And when I was listening to Prime Minister talking about positive thing that President is no longer almighty, I mean, yes, that's the fact, but it made me smile. And I mean, listening to his speech, I think we still have much better speech writers than policymakers in this country, unfortunately. But talking about the president's rights, yes, we changed the constitution, so president is no longer the head of executive. But what we are doing for the last 10 months in the parliament is permanently adopting a legislation by which we take away functions from president, moving these functions to government. And that's very bad. That's very bad not because I have more personal sympathies to this gentleman rather than the other gentleman talking before him, but it's because it's bad because we damage institutions by that.
Which I mean, we
changed the constitution and we changed the constitutional system, but it does not mean that on a daily basis president should be deprived additional rights from what was changed as a part of systemic change. That's very different, Mr. President. And we were competitors at the elections, but still, despite this fact, I'm strongly against depriving you basic functions which you as president have.
because it's my respect to Institute of Presidents. And when we have National Security Council in this country, and the National Security Council in the country is very similar to the system which you have in the United States. When we have National Security Council in this country, I don't see a reason of creating the parallel structure under the government calling National Safety and Crisis Management Council. Yes, one has now the Security Council, another has Safety Council, but what are the functions? What are the responsibilities? How the job is divided between these two? So we see an attempt to weaken the institutions, not only based on revision of the past and fighting the legacy of previous government, but also based on the current political situation as well. And I think, yeah, I may talk about procedural democracy later, David, not now, not at this point, but I think from the viewpoint of state building, those are bad signals. And to me, a very bad indicator was the last NDI poll, when first time in the last 10 years we saw the dramatic drop in public trust to institutions. Two major institutions which enjoyed the broad public support, Army and Police. Both of them have nearly 10% drop in public support in last NDI poll. To me, it's a bad sign, and to me, that's an indicator that we should deal with our internal differences in business, in differences and troubles in other way, not by attacking the institutions, not by depriving each other the functions, not by sending each other to jails. These are not the ways how the problems are resolved in the countries. We should deal with our problems in different ways by not shaking and not attacking the foundation of Georgian state. I mean, and that is the lesson learned from these days to me. And very last moment about the international environment, because state building is not conducted in closed environment or in vacuum. And starting from the very first days of our state, we had a strong external factor, which is Russia. And we clearly see that Russia is a power not interested in having stable and successful neighbors along its borders. And the message which we all try, we and Europeans and Americans try to send to Russians, that every nation benefits from flourishing and predictable neighbors. Yes, that's the right message, assuming that you want to see these neighbors as neighbors. And that is the problem with Russia, that Russia does not want to see Georgians as neighbors. Russia does not want to see Ukrainians as neighbors. They do not want to see Belarusians as neighbors, Kazakhs as neighbors. They want to see all these countries not as neighbors, but as territories which can be influenced and controlled by them. And they even have the special definition of near abroad for them. What it means, the near abroad. What the definition near means. Why, for example, Finland is a real abroad and Georgia is a near abroad. What's the difference between Finland and Georgia? In terms of territory, they are both Russian neighbors. So why Finns are real neighbors and we are near neighbors? What it means? It simply means their political attitude that our neighborhood is something temporary, which should be changed, while they accept the fact, at least for the moment being, that Finns are the real neighbors, or Poles or others are real neighbors. And for us, it's something temporary which can be changed and should be changed. So that's the Russian policy from the very first days, and it's not surprising that what happened in Georgia in all these years now continues in Ukraine, and Ukraine has a crucial importance for us, because fight in Ukraine today is fight for Europe, it's fight for the international principles of international security, but for us it's even more. It's a fight for possibility to have a modern state in post-Soviet space. Because if Ukraine is not allowed to create a modern state, if Ukraine is not allowed to create a European state, if Ukraine is not allowed to create a state which is based on the will of its own people, if Ukraine is not allowed to do it, then what chances we as Georgians have to do the same? So for us, fight in Ukraine is the same fight for the future of our independent and modern state. So I understand how important Ukraine is for everybody, for Americans, for Europeans. I understand that for them, Ukraine is a fight for defending international order and international law and principles. For us, it's even more than that. Because for us, success of Ukraine is success of our own perspective to build independent and strong state in this neighborhood, being near neighbors to not dear neighbors, not real neighbors, but near neighbors to Russia. So for us, Ukraine is a very, very important case, and the Russian factor is one of those which cannot be ignored while talking about Georgia's state and state building. So thank you very much. I'll stop with that, and I'll be looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, now it's my turn. I wanted to start by saying that I am somewhat different from members of this panel because they are prominent political leaders. I am independent scholar, but Mr. Supashvili's speech was so philosophical that I cannot say that anymore, so I will not be able to be so different after all. And now, state building is, of course, a very crucial problem for Georgia. It's a very painful problem for Georgia. I have been, veteran participant of international conferences, and the whole 90s we were talking about Georgia as failed state and failing state, and starting from that. One should remember that that was also partly legacy of the Soviet Union, paradoxically as it is. Me and Frank Fukuyama, we share appreciation of Samuel Huntington and his seminal book on political order in changing society. So when I teach students this book, I somehow have to make excuse for the obvious mistake which he makes on page 1 or page 2, when he says that Soviet Union is as modern, accomplished, legitimate, functional state as Western democracies. It just happens to be different, more oppressive, etc., different ideology, but those are two models of functional states, and then they are dysfunctional states. But this was sort of true superficially, of course, but it proved very misleading and elusive, and this is that kind of paradox that on the one hand Soviet Union was about strengths, but on the other hand legacy of the Soviet regime was fundamental and structural weakness of stateness and statehood in this region. And it's true of Russia and it's true of many other countries, but within that general context, Georgia and Tajikistan maybe were two worst cases of fully failed state, basically. And we were a fully failed state in the early 90s. For the next decade, mostly it coincided with Mr. Shevardnadze's rule. We were kind of very weak to failing states. And so that was kind of a syndrome or a problem which is always back at our mind. So if we look at this big picture, then we accomplished a lot. So our state today is much better as, on account of stateness rather than other there are many other problems, of course. But still we run very deep deficits also in terms of how accomplished we are as a state. And I will kind of run this short inventory of these accomplishments and deficits according to like 4 avenues or 4 arenas of stateness or state building. The first and most basic one, of course, I will sometimes repeat something which was said. It's inevitable when you are the last one on the panel. But the first, this avenue is building territorial state and citizenship, political community. In order to have a state, you need borders, which are both recognized and real, and you need political community of people who share, who accept being under the same government. And of course, it's obvious that we have failed on that. 20% of our territory is under occupation, separated, whatever we say. We don't control that. But, and it's obvious to say that we are failing, but I would say that we have accomplishments in that too, because apart from those 2 regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, there were lots of areas of dubious or uncertain jurisdictions in Georgia. Ajara is the most obvious example. Pankisi Valley is another example. Arguably, Samtskhe Javakheti to some extent can also be considered as an example. And by now we can say that yes, 20% are de facto separated, but on the other 80%, we are more or less, let's say so, consolidated nation. There are problems with minorities and attitudes to minorities or their integration. I can talk a lot about that, I will not, but there is obvious progress in that. So the second avenue is state efficacy or functionality or state capacity. When we talked about, and it was also mentioned, I just can briefly repeat that we were a failed state, especially on this account. We could not enforce monopoly on legitimate use of force, which is kind of recognized as a basic feature of stateness. Government could not raise taxes, government could not pay salaries and make people, their public servants, work for salaries rather than opportunities of bribes or embezzlement or whatever. So state could not providing obvious most basic public services like taking care of infrastructure or having, you know, basic social services, etc. The most obvious and some sort of glaring achievement of the last 10 years is that this is basically solved. Of course, there is always kind of space for growth and improvement, but generally we abandoned this category of failing state. We have become functional state in that sense. Of course, sustainability is a question, but it's a good news that this functional state survived one change of powers. There were expectations in some corners that this also functionality of state would break up after this, but it did not. I mean, we can argue about quality of this or quality of that, but generally, I think it's very dangerous to say accomplished on anything, but here at least this is no longer our most important problem. The third avenue, which is also mentioned many times, is geopolitical, international. I think many social scientists in the West tend to think that state building is mostly a matter of domestic kind of policy, building institutions, you know, developing constitutional systems, etc., which is important. But of course, states depend on mutual recognition, and especially, of course, small states, which are vulnerable by virtue of being small, depend on finding a proper place in international space, international system, international security system. And this is obviously where we are in trouble, and which was mentioned, as I said. Good news is that we have a fairly stable internal consensus on what kind of state we want to build. We can, state is somewhat abstract term. There are different models of state. So at least on the level of rhetoric, all our government said that we want to build a European kind of state, European type of state. And the idea that we want to be part of Europe has fairly broad public support. That's good news. The bad news is that the other side, which is the West, where the American part of it or European part of it, it cannot make up its mind what to do with our region, which makes us a fault line region, uncertain region. And this continues, and I think we are maybe now in the most dramatic and decisive stage of that. And it's one thing that, I mean, we don't know what will happen in Ukraine, and we somehow assume that whatever happens in Ukraine, it will have a bearing to Georgia, but it also has a global consequence, I think, that it's not only about fate of Georgia and Ukraine, it's about credibility of the West, credibility of Europe, credibility of the United States, and I think credibility of the West, of Europe and the United States have suffered very important blows so far. And to some extent about what the West did or did not in 2008, but especially now what it does or does not with regards to Ukraine. And it has importance for Georgians' state building, not only in the sense that we are afraid of another Russian intervention, but also that internally the firmness of our consensus, internal consensus, that we need to be with Europe, that it's a good idea, that we have to be a state like Europe and not state like Russia, that may suffer, that may erode. There is already some signs of that. And the fourth and the most controversial issue is an arena or avenue of state building is about let's say so, stability and predictability of political system, of which the most important part of succession of power, how power changes in the country, what is the system of that. And democracy is, of course, the best performer, which makes me happy because I like democracy. So it's also best performer on this, that in at least those democracies that we call consolidated democracy are the most stable states because they know how to change power without major upheavals. In that, we are very bad performers. We are used that we need upheavals. We need something extraordinary to change power. We had 4 changes of power, but each time it was sort of revolution. It was not just a normal routine process. And here I am afraid I will disagree with my fellow philosopher colleague, President Margvelashvili. He said that we are consolidated democracy already. Okay, I'm here for a long time. Of course, this government says that. Previous government also said that. Government before that, Mr. Shornada's government said that. Before that, Mr. Kamsakhurdia was saying that. So that's normal. I am not expecting them to say something different, but as scholars, of course, we look at, let's say so, objective indicators. Now we had presidential elections, mentioned here a couple of times last year. These 2 guys were major competitors. Number 1 got 62%, number 2 got 22%, and he was happy that he got so much. And his supporters were not happy, they wanted more.
48% now, and I have 48%.
Yeah, that's different thing. Okay, I mean the electoral result. I don't know any consolidated democracy in the world where in presidential elections you have this kind of gap. We had municipal elections just recently, where all municipalities, absolutely all municipalities in Georgia, in all elections, one political force won. I don't know any consolidated democracy in the world where we have such result in elections. Of course, it's good that technically international observers kind of said that they are better than previous elections. That's a progress, but I think we still are not there. And I remember, you know, in my favorite journal of democracies, there were articles after Ukrainian elections when Orange Coalition gave way to Mr. Yanukovych. Everybody said, oh, now Ukraine is consolidated. Unfortunately, then we had Maidan, and we see that it's not the case, even without Russian factor, which is, of course, now very huge in Ukraine, but we should remember that as well. So we remember, as political scholars say, hybrid regime, and specifically that kind of regime, which is called usually, I like that formula of Tom Carothers, dominant power system, where there is single political party or political force, which may be called coalition or party, does not matter, which controls all levels of power. And this, after all changes, all great changes, this is kind of reconstituting itself. And we can speak whether it's structurally, there are some structural reasons maybe in development of civil society, political culture, whatever. We may discuss it with Frank 2 days later in Free University, but the fact is there. And we have this same, and that creates also the problem of continuity of state, as to some extent touched on by Mr. Bakradze, that every new government, after another revolutionary change, says that, of course, I recognize and appreciate very much, I wanted to say it in the beginning of the fourth and last part of my speech, that the precedent of electoral change in power in 2012 was a great precedent, but one precedent does not change the rules of the game, especially when it was extraordinary precedent. It depended on a single individual having enormous wealth by Georgian standards. By American standards, he would be simply very rich. By Georgian standards, he was super rich. So, and some also philosophically inclined Georgian observers said it was kind of a case of deus ex machina. so that without him, everybody agrees. I mean, some people like him, some people dislike him. I don't want to go into that. That without him, the electoral change of power would be impossible. So I think everybody agrees to that. So this extraordinary circumstance cannot be always replicated. Therefore, this change of power, however good precedent it was, absolutely welcome precedent, no doubt about that, does not create a trust or belief that the next change of power will be similar, because I don't think we'll have somebody who is 5 times richer than Mr. Ivanishvili to defeat him. So that's a real structural problem, and as I said, every government in this situation starts state anew. So every of our great leaders was a founder of a new state. Of course, in effect, in reality, as an analyst, I can describe continuity of state. And also after this change of power, we have lots of continuity in practice. But in discourse, in attitudes, in political attitudes, it's more Jacobin idea that there was dark age, and these guys, not these guys specifically, but this government, when they speak in Georgian, speak very differently than for international audience. There was dark age, there was just, terrible people, and we came, and there is a new dawn and new life. And I don't want to be too political. Previous government was also like that to some extent. Mr. Shevardnadze's government also said that there was provincial fascism. Now we become real Democrats. Everybody starts like that. That this is new state. This is new political system. We are starting from scratch. Everybody wants to write a new constitution. Sometimes they manage, sometimes not. But everybody says that we need new constitution because old government was so bad they could not leave us a good constitution. And everybody says that of course we need opposition, but these guys are terrible. These guys should disappear from political radars, and then one day we'll have a nice opposition, and with them we will cooperate. But these guys are so terrible, we cannot cooperate with them. Some people say we should put them in jail, or some maybe not, but generally there is no concept of legitimate opposition. And I say not only about this government, but this is our Sept tradition, let's say so. That opposition is considered something marginal and vindictive and something that should be somehow put aside. And while we have that, we are a hybrid regime, which many my fellow scholars in democratization studies try to define differently, but my definition is that a combination of failing autocracy with failing democracy. So I'm happy that we are failing as autocracy, but I am unhappy that we are continue failing as a democracy. So that is, I think, out of these 4 areas of state building, continues to be, unfortunately, the most problematic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to get a chance to give a talk in the session after this one, so I don't want to take terribly much time. But I want to make an observation that will then be a question to the 4 panelists, and any of you can respond to it. It does seem to me, from the perspective of an outsider, that maybe, Gia, you were a little bit too pessimistic in your wrap-up, because it seems to me that Georgia, now there's a reaction, which is perfectly understandable to those abuses, and now you're dialing back and putting in more checks. And the question really is, I think, the one that several people have identified, is whether this is simply an alternation of 2 parties that want to grab power, or whether this is really an effort to build institutions and respect the permanent rules that should exist beyond the tenure of any one administration. And I must say, first of all, it's a great pleasure to actually see both the government and the opposition represented on, the same panel and talking to each other civilly. I'm not sure you could do this in Washington, D.C. right now. I guess from my perspective, and looking at this as an outsider, it's not a bad outcome, you know, in the end, that there's been this alternation and this debate and this constant effort to recalibrate, you know, that boundary between state power and checks on state power. So maybe with that, and then we're running a little bit late, but then I want to open the floor to questions. So if any of you have any observations or reactions to that,
Okay, I have some record of that Georgia is a different country because it does not have this kind of task now, this government that Saakashvili had in 2003, and this difference in structure of tasks may help them to, you know, go further. But there is no guarantee of that. So that may happen or may not. And without, that's a problem which we are going to debate also in 2 days, but we have debated in Georgia, and Mr. Saakashvili said that, you know, it's procedural democracy is one thing, state building is another thing. There is some kind of, it's considered politically incorrect to recognize, but, you know, there may be some sequencing that you suggested that, you know, you need to develop effective state, and for that you need concentration of power, but concentration of power is not good for procedural democracy, but once you have it, you can focus on something else, which is logical, but in order to have procedural democracy, you cannot have just a benevolent king who wants to proceed to develop procedural democracy. I do believe that Mr. Saakashvili sincerely wants to have procedural democracy of Georgia, and he's benevolent, but he's not a king, the king. So, and those people who are kings, do they want really procedural democracy or not? Okay, I will not proceed on that, but there are some doubts on that.
I have to respond to what Professor Nodia is talking about, and I want to take the main target on the word that you just used during your comment, and you said we have no guarantees. And what are the guarantees? And later you started talking about individuals, kings, and the important players within Georgian political system. But I think that one of the main guarantees, not only in this country, but in the countries around the world, are the people who are going to secure the system as a functioning democracy. And when I was talking about a consolidated democratic process, I especially stressed the last local government elections as the elections that have shown to our citizens and revealed to our citizens their very important role in forming the new governance. You evaluated the local government elections from the, let's say, the negative side, talking that the only one and leading political power has come to majorities. And I agree with you, this does not look very nice. On the other hand, this is the reason not of the voters of their trust to the process, but this is the reason of the appropriate legislature which crafted the calculation of the voices so that it is the leading party who normally comes to power. Though percentages there were not tragic. From case to case, it was the opposition had high percentages, but the system of calculation is such that it's leading power. And what I'm saying, it's not the reason of voters that we have unipartial majority in local government. It's the reason of legislation. But the voters, the belief that citizens have here was strengthened through this election, that they do matter. Because in many cases we had second rounds which we didn't have before, and the second rounds were determined by the fact that voters, and the fact of the second round showed the voters that it's they are who decide and their voice matters. So I think that in the process of consolidating democracy we are still ahead, and it's truism around the world that if it's not the people, if it's not society, democracy is going to fail in any country. And if we analyze the democracies not through the power of civil society and power of people, but analyze those democracies through kings engaged, I believe that if they didn't have a check from society, majority of prominent democracies would collapse, and you would get, this is the nature of politicians, this is the nature of human beings, that they are corrupted with power, and they will be corrupted in power unless there is a strong check on them. So I believe that this check of civil society, this check of Georgian voter and Georgian citizen has become stronger over the period of time, and it became stronger, especially in recent events where the government was changed through electoral process. So I'm optimistic because I see this feeling, not only in voters but also in political players, that they do believe that through a fair electoral process, if they are successful, they will change the government, not through revolution, not through rebel, but through elections. And I think that this is a very important factor in developing stabilized and consolidated democracies. Thank you.
Yeah, two short notes on democracy. Basically, I do agree with your conclusion, Dr. Fukuyama, which is more honor for me than for you, I think, but I still do agree. But talking about democracy, two short points. One, I mean, as I said, the final test for what happened in Georgia in previous years was the ability of the system to have a peaceful transfer of power after elections, and the system passed that test, which means that the system was functional. And the second is understanding of democracy, what democracy is. And I think the strong state institutions is inevitable part and essential part of democracy, because otherwise we move to the Soviet understanding of democracy, which is the ability to do anything you want, which is anarchy and chaos. And this was also perception in Georgia, specifically in last years of Shevardnadze, when people's ability not to pay taxes was seen as democracy. I don't pay taxes because it's democracy. And like when we introduced the compulsory, rule to fasten the seat belts for many citizens in this country, it was seen as government's tyranny, because the point was that I'm sitting in my car, and if it is democracy, it's up to me whether I fasten seat belt or not, and the government should not intervene. But it's not a democracy, it's a chaos. So having an order, having rules, and having strong institutions is an essential part of democracy. So by building strong institutions in previous years, we're also contributing to building the democracy. And that's my second point, together with the peaceful transfer of power.
Well, I'll continue on the example of the belts, which Mr. Bakradze mentioned. During Shevardnadze's era, which we are mentioning in the late 90s, such initiative was introduced several times, as some people remember here. But it was impossible to implement. People would just refuse to do that, and police would use this new rule as a new trap for corruption. And it was not implemented. And when Saakashvili introduced the same rule, in 3 days, all the citizens of Georgia were obeying the rule, and they were carrying this bell as appropriate thing. Why? Because, yes, people realized the existence of the state, existence of the rule, and the ability of the state to implement those rules and to punish those who would not obey to those rules. In that sense, yes, we went through remarkable stage from the chaos and anarchy, in that sense, to order and rules and so on. And without going in details, what the person tied with the belt meant for the previous government, because it meant not having belt in the car, but in everything, and in the mouth and during the voting. So what we need to do, I believe, and what is the challenge of the new government and the society, and we are not talking about the governments only, we are talking about the society and about the people and the understanding and so on, to introduce more freedoms, more democratic institutions, and to increase the meaning of one single citizen without having them not obey to the rules. So I want to see Georgian citizens obeying the rules and being tied with the belt, but at the same time being those who dictate the agenda in the political life of the country. Therefore, I am glad and I am optimistic to see that 95% consolidated democracy, which we used to have in 90s and early 2000 and during the Rose Revolution, is now about 65% democracy in terms of majority gets, or ruling party gets that. But I hope that it will come down lower than 50% when no party or coalition or kings or former kings or future kings who are now in the society and so have no illusion that they can grab more than majority of the society's support and then establish the law of ruler rather than follow the laws which are made by the people and by the institutions. In that sense, of course, we are making progress, but nothing is guaranteed, and it will never be guaranteed. And that's the mistake. If we ever believe that something is already guaranteed, on the philosophical level or on pragmatic level, immediately we will see the failure. Because in this sense, this is never-ending job. Because no democracy, no level of rule of law or anything could change the nature of the human and the nature of the power. Therefore, this is process, and I believe we are moving to the right direction. Thank you.
All right, so we'll open the floor for questions. So if I call on you, please identify yourself briefly. So, Andre, is there a microphone or?
Thank you. I'm Tamara Chergoleshvili. I'm from Tabula Media. Thank you, Dr. Fukuyama, for giving me the floor. Well, I'd like to comment on the procedural democracy that was mentioned, like here by the chairman of the parliament. And then comes my question: what kind of procedural democracy are we talking about when, according to public opinion polls, more than half of the Georgian population believes that Georgia is governed by a person, an oligarch who is not accountable, like politically accountable before the population, and who just sort of stripes away the president of his functions just because he was disappointed, like because he revealed like the character. I'm quoting him. And as for my question, you've enumerated the landmark reforms implemented by the United National Movement when he was in power. Mr. Chairman and Mr. President, I would like you to name, because I was listening to the chair of the government and he was quite defensive as he was answering to certain allegations. I didn't see the positive agenda. What are the reforms in the pipeline, or what are the reforms that have been implemented that you would call your landmark reforms that contributed to the state building in Georgia? Thank you. To the state building in Georgia. We are talking about state building on this conference, no?
So if we are talking about the state, I mean, it's strange that I have to ask for the government, but whatever. I think that during these 2 years, the coalition has showed some of the very significant and important political targets, and I can name those to you. I mean, one of the main things that, while being in government, we were engaged was that we changed the concentration, the orientation of the government system, and targeted the system towards an individual, and made the state more concentrated on the needs and the social needs of the individuals. And this might be a questionable policy from different approaches, but I think that the state, socially oriented state oriented on the needs and cares of individual, is a state that I believe is a right one. And I can name to you the developments that were done in this channel and in this direction, in direction of healthcare, targeting healthcare system to the individual, targeting the reforms that I have done in social targeting the educational, not really improving the educational system, but making it more socially oriented in education. That's what was done by me. The same kind of reforms were done in the agricultural sector that really did not improve the agricultural sector, but created a more targeted policy towards people living in rural areas. So those are and were the changes that were important for me, and that still are important for me. I believe that in the process of transition, the state should take care of its citizens and treat them as an individual, valuable thing. And I think that this is a contribution to the state building. Furthermore, if we look at the next two elections conducted after the coalition came to power, I can say basically, and I think that David, as my competitor on election, will agree, the presidential elections were conducted in an absolutely free, fair, calm, and European kind of election campaign, and the election day. I think this is also a contribution to Georgian state building. And I have talked quite a bit about the local government elections, which, yes, if we evaluate the fact that we have only government coalition being leader in every polling station, yeah, this is not the nicest thing to do, but these were elections where people saw and felt that their vote matters. So I think that those are concentration of the government towards a concrete individual, concentrating and increasing the value of an individual, electoral, personal, sort of making a target that state cares about your life, cares about your education. I think that this was an important part of the state building. Thank you.
Andrei Larionov, Gate Institute. I have a comment and two small questions. Comment concerning Mr. Saakashvili, discussion of the, seems to me, as I understood your speech, excessive military expenditures prior to the year 2008 war and about that time. It seems to me the justification of these expenditures have been clearly shown during the war, when the Georgian army, with very high price, nevertheless was able at least postpone and to some extent defend independence and even the some kind of construction of modern state in Georgia. If those spending have not occurred before that, so probably we would be living right now in a very difficult circumstance, and maybe the very fact of this conference would be under very serious question, because that would be, using your terms and terms of other colleagues, would be under control of some other power. So that is why probably building effective defending capacity is only also one of the very important elements of modern state, especially if your neighbor is quite unpredictable and has imperial ambitions. My two questions, also probably to you and as well as Mr. President. In both your remarks, probably in remarks of the Prime Minister, Mr. Prime Minister, you talk about this some kind of external factor, using such terms like control of the territory, some kind of the sphere of privileged interest and so on. But it seems to me it's quite clear, omitting two very precise legal terms, aggression and occupation. And especially you have a law on occupied territories. Could you explain what is the logic behind omitting these particular terms? Is it of kind of political necessity or political some kind of expectations, whatever? And another also issue, there were many parallels have been mentioned between Georgia in year 2008 and Ukraine in year 2014. And we know that it's a lot of parallels. But there is one quite clear, conspicuous difference. In year 2008, Ukraine has provided a lot of support and aid to Georgia, from military to political one. And the Ukrainian president, with Polish president, along with Baltic leaders, flew to Tbilisi and stood up here on August 12th, year 2008, in the center of Tbilisi in the mass rally. Why nothing similar has been done by Georgian authorities when Ukraine happened to be under similar attack? And my last point, having listened to Professor Nodi about the tests for consolidated democracy, it came to my mind that one more test can be offered. It's a rule. Winners do not take all, even it is a very peaceful transformation of power. And non-persecution of your political opponents, even you as a position win the election and win the power. Now we have a wonderful picture of current Speaker of the Parliament and the former Speaker of Parliament sitting on this panel. I think the case of consolidated democracy in Georgia would be much stronger if here would be current Prime Minister and former Prime Minister, current President and former President. So based on this criteria of this test, probably on this, it's maybe only 1/3 of the potential level of consolidated democracy in Georgia, and there is some room for improvement.
Thank you very much for these very educative questions, and I would ask especially the Stanford Fellows to pay attention to the questions and to the answers as well, because this is probably what is this conference about. What is the process and how to distinguish political battle and political controversies from the very important thing, the building of the state and addressing the fundamental issues which affects Georgian society and societies around. First of all, I hope all the proceedings are recorded. When I mentioned military expenditure, what I said was that unfortunately Georgia had to have such military expenditure because Georgia was building its state, and not Saakashvili, not Tusupashvili, not Ivanishvili, but Georgian people. We are building their state in these circumstances when the big enemy, Russia, was left as the only peacekeeper in those conflict regions, separatist regions. And Georgia had to spend 25% of its budget. That's what I said. And also I said, unfortunately, even that expenditure appeared not effective when the war with Russia happened and when Georgia was confronted with Russia alone, when nobody on the earth was ready or willing to help us. That was my comment about 25% of the expenditure, and that's the problem I was describing, that in this hostile environment, when the sovereignty of Georgia is not guaranteed, when unfortunately the NATO member countries are not ready to take that risk, yes, it is going to be a risk to accept Georgia and to give to Georgia not map, but the membership. And if I am asked what the world community should be doing tomorrow, literally, it's the decision about taking Georgia into NATO and to make that bold move in order to rescue the region, rescue this country, and rescue the world order. That's our policy. That's what I am saying. And of course, military expenditure is part of sovereignty. But what I am saying is that probably Georgia, as well as Ukraine and others, must be allowed by the world system and by the world order to use its scarce resources for something else and not only for defense, and not to be under constant threat of aggression, of another military action, of another war, of another bombing of our cities, villages, ports and railways and highways and so on. That's what I am concerned about. That's what I am telling, that the challenge of building state in Georgia, democratic state, not so democratic, going from failing state to functional state, in this process, I believe the security issue must be removed. Security concerns must be reduced. And that will enable all of us, this government, future governments, to be concentrated on the building of modern state. That was my comment, and not the kind of question whether Georgia should be spending on the military and so on. When we are spending on the military, and we are renewing our military capabilities, we are buying new arms, defensive arms, we are asking our friends from NATO countries to give us more defense capabilities, and this is what the new government is doing. Therefore, I just cannot take that question. Now, about avoiding words of aggression and so on, when I was listening to this question, I was just shaking my head, because probably it was talking my colleague Mr. Kandelaki, who is teaching us lessons every day in the parliamentary session about the very same issue. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. If one is concerned about Georgia and one wants to learn the truth, I don't think that Georgian president or the head of the parliament or anybody should be asked that question, that we are questioning what is happening in Georgia. I'm sorry, I represent the party, Republican Party, which was founded in 1978. 1978. And the demand of that party was independent Georgia, end of imperialistic rule of Russia, and NATO membership of Georgia. And my party leaders spent 4 or 5 years in Soviet gulags, and they are sitting next to me in Georgian parliament. And you are asking me question, what is the role of Russia in Georgian life in the past and now? And you are asking questions whether we have the problem using the term of aggression. It was aggression, it was war. And I was the one who repeated these things in the opposition, in the government, from the parliament and so on. But the problem is that sometimes not only local actors, but international actors are so deeply involved in some political gambling and gaming that the most fundamental issues, state building, democracy, institutions, is forgotten completely. And this is not helping my country. This is not helping, it was not helpful for the previous government, it's not going to be helpful for this government. When people are just even more one-sided and want to look to the things to black and white perspective than local political spectrum. This is very important thing. And I believe, I urge everybody to use more, I would say, deeper analysis when the situation in Armenia, in Indonesia, in Paraguay, where I went just a month ago, is concerned and addressed. Because we expect from the scholars, from the analysts, from the people who come here to learn something, not to question whether we believe Russia is aggressor or not. What is going now at the NATO summit and about helping Ukraine and so on? This is not a man who could not be recognized. He's much taller and much bigger than me. Is not enough this body to be in Kiev for you to represent Georgia? Or we need to send to everybody special news and picture that yes, our president is in Kiev and please see it and don't blame us not to be helpful to them? What Georgian government is doing in Ukraine and about Ukraine and with Ukraine is daily coordinated with Washington, Brussels, Berlin and London. And I take responsibility about these words. Daily. So please be more responsible. Everybody, Mrs. Opposition Representative as well. I understand that there is anger. I'm sorry. Yes, now it's my time is come. My time is come. But this is not the forum where we need to talking about internal political issues. And I was not going to respond to Tamara's question at all. But your question made me... No, because President answered.
Okay, we are running a little bit late. There's a couple of questions on this side. Maybe can we take both of them? And
so since Mr. Speaker mentioned me, can I just make a very quick point? I'm Georgi Kandelaki. I'm an MP with UNM and David Bakradze. Let me just state a very straightforward fact. For the duration of the whole period since the Georgian Dream is in power, there has not been a single high-level bilateral trip to Kiev. Mr. President was there, but for the inauguration, which doesn't count. No Georgian Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, or Defense has been in Kiev, not only during the start of the crisis, at Maidan that is, for example, or even during Yanukovych. And by doing this and other sequence of actions, Mr. Ivanishvili, who more than 50% of the Georgian citizens admit, which is true, that he is the ultimate holder of power without holding any office, recognizes de facto Russia's sphere of influence over Ukraine. But my question or comment is about democracy. As we know from theory of democracy, one time, so to speak, change of power through elections is by far not enough to count a political system as a consolidated democracy. Indeed, we know many countries, including in our region, for example, Ukraine or Belarus, where democratic elections took place, power changed through elections, but then these systems slided back, or democracies even broke down in some countries, such as, for example, in Belarus. There are various definitions of what is a consolidated democracy. There is obviously Samuel Huntington's 2 times turnover rule. There is also a more minimal definition by Juan and Linz that consolidated democracy is when mainstream actors agree about rules of political contestation. But in Georgia, let me also present very quick couple of facts. The holders of power, the decision makers, such as the Prime Minister, such as Mr. Ivanishvili, who is quote-unquote king in Georgia without holding any formal office, have repeatedly and publicly questioned the right of the UNM, which is the only opposition in parliament, to exist and function as an opposition. These are public statements. Moreover, Mr. Ivanishvili has linked publicly the scale of prosecutions with the rhetoric of UNM. And it's also a fact of life that almost entire leadership of UNM is either already in jail, and that's why former Prime Minister cannot be here because he's in jail, or under prosecution. So I think if we employ tools of modern social science, Georgian democracy is sliding back, and finally, we have abundance of what Ivan Krastev calls democracy's doubles. That is anti-system actors that wrap themselves into a democratic camouflage, who have extensive track record of xenophobia or Stalinism and so forth. Thank you.
Support our transitional period in Egypt and believe that we are on the right track. My question here is, I do believe that we have a failed Arab Spring, and my question to the Georgian panelists, what kind of advice you can give to us with something that we should avoid or something that we should work on, with the exception of perhaps Tunisia, the rest of the Arab countries that didn't succeed in establishing democracy. So if you can have an advice for us, it will be really appreciated. And I would like to say something very quickly to my Georgian colleagues here, that the most important thing in democracy is to see things are progressing. You don't compare what is written on the books with what's happening on the ground, because that's quite difficult to achieve it in a very small number of years. But as far as you feel that there is some real progress on the ground, that's the most important thing. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Giga Bokiri. I'm from UNM also. I'm a colleague of Mr. Kandelaki, and I have a question to Mr. Nodia. A quick comment. Obviously, we are all pleased to be at this very interesting event, and Mr. Fukuyama's words about Georgian reforms and their uniqueness really flattered us as the representatives of the former team, and I was also particularly glad that PM was not in the room to listen to this praise, because otherwise Stanford University would be labeled as UNM stooges. This is a new fashion in Georgia that NDI, Washington Post, and all others are controlled by the opposition. I think it's a very worrying trend for our state building, because it's something we have forgotten in this country and something we hear from some of our neighboring countries, where any Western institution who might criticize the government or praise the previous government is looked at with suspicion. Not Russian institutions, but Western. So that's the big worrying sign. And now our question is about the topic which was widely covered here, but it seemed to me that Mr. Nodia's description of the last peaceful transfer of power as another upheaval could be a bit dangerous if we compare bloody coup, a revolution, peaceful but still a revolution, and a peaceful transfer of power as the same kind of events. Because even with extraordinary circumstances that you described, isn't it the case that the fact that it happened within the institutional framework is the important one? Of course, I agree with Mr. Kandelaki that the events afterwards are the challenge when the winner publicly declares that the losers must disappear or go to jail if they disturb them. That's in essence the policy, and I know it's wrapped up in this rule of law wrapping, but we all know it's not true. So that's my question about this particular thing. And the last comment about the backsliding on the government's ability to enforce the law. Because that's another important part of the state building in Georgia or elsewhere, that the government must be the sole agent who has a monopoly on using power. Of course, limited, and I accept the criticism that our leadership's big problem was lack of checks and balances inside and outside system. But now we have a situation when the country is governed by somebody who is not in official position, and we all know that. When institutions are abused and humiliated, like presidential institution, every day on air and in the parliament. And besides the political arrest, we see, as we saw a year ago at the square next to us, a profound disability of police to contain the violent agents of this society, especially the fundamentalistic groups which are challenging the secular fundamentals of this country. Isn't that an additional problem, Mr. Nodia? Thank you.
My name is Nicholas Rurua. I'm from newspaper Iberia, and since we're running out of time, I'll be quite short. I would like the Speaker of the Parliament and Mr. President to give us their opinions about the following point. Don't they think simply that the next peaceful transition of power is endangered by the pre-trial detention and prosecution of former members of cabinets that are the fact these days in Georgia, the fact that several former ministers and even president is wanted, sets, in my opinion, extremely dangerous precedent for the next losers in elections, who will know that after giving up the power, they will become the hunted ones. So I think I would like to hear from President and Mr. Usupashvili this exact point. Thank you.
This is basically the only question that was that I was asked about. I don't think that I have to respond to other questions as well. I think that of course for any political system, and I'm answering the question about detentions, for any political system, you would not wish and you would not think that this is ideal, that the political system goes after the change of the government. You have people being questioned or put into jail for their previous performance. And I think that it is not an easy situation, and it's a situation that is complicated, that is problematic not only it's problematic overall for the whole political system of Georgia. But we have, in analyzing this situation, we have to take into consideration several details. First is that political responsibility or political verdict for the leadership of UNM and for the leadership of the previous government has already been enacted. And it has been enacted not by prosecutor's office, not by the courts, but by the Georgian people who voted for in another way, and thus they concluded their attitude towards political activities or political success or political future of the UNM and its members. That means that that is the end for any kind of political questioning of the UNM members. They cannot be questioned on political issues by prosecutor's office or by police, because this decision is not within the criminal courts, and any political questioning has been finished through the voting, and we see that UNM has been put out of the office, and that was the verdict of Georgian people. Now, there are cases that are in prosecutor's office that are processed on some very high government officials, and those cases, once more, they cannot be political, but they can be only on the issue of criminal justice. Would those kind of questions be asked to an ordinary citizen? Let's assess and evaluate the case from this perspective. Would the questions that are asked now to some high government officials from the law enforcement bodies, would an ordinary citizen be asked questions like this? If there were such kind of allegations, and we all know that they would be asked. But of course, asking those questions to people who hold high government positions, who have in many cases very high, very intensive current political biography, especially outside of Georgia, asking these questions is not very comfortable for the Georgian government, because we have here very often a very intensive critique of the prosecutor's office and allegations that there is a political witch hunt in Georgia. So we are facing this fact. I think that this is not the best case, this is not the most comfortable situation, and no one would dream for a situation like this, but I believe that everyone engaged, whether this is government, whether this is prosecutor's office, and also engaging people who are asked the questions, have to come out with a stronger democracy out of this situation. And when I'm saying about stronger democracy, I also mean responsibility of previous president to answer the questions that are asked to him. I think that it was politically very damaging for Georgia when President refused to answer the prosecutor's questions. Not because he's not right, not because he doesn't have a good answer, but because this damaged the image of Georgia. And when we are talking, when my colleagues here are talking about a peaceful transfer of power and the peaceful transition, this a priori means that the president, who has been 2 times president of this nation and who has transferred power peacefully to a new government, is respecting this government, and it's respecting its offices, it's respecting its prosecutor's office, no matter how he is not comfortable with this. So on one hand, I think that there is responsibility of previous president and previous opposition leaders to answer the questions and respect the state institutions, including prosecutor's office. On the other hand, there is our responsibility there is my responsibility as the president of this nation, and also as a guarantor of the constitutional rights and freedoms, to secure that the process is clearly within the boundaries of criminal law, and there is no political component in those investigations. I think that it is a complicated and it's a complicated case. It's a case that will require principled stand of many of political actors, but I believe that through this case, Georgia will become a stronger democracy and will become a stronger state eventually. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I want to apologize to everybody who came here for listening about issues and analysis of the broader subject as it is building of the modern state, but had to witness some usual interpolitical whatever fight here, which I tried not to respond, but yeah, sometimes not to respond means kind of not to have answer. And when we are talking about the modern state and its principles, I mentioned during my very first intervention that we are in the middle and nothing is guaranteed. And everything depends on what we are able to learn from our own or others' mistakes. What the new government now in Georgia can learn from the mistakes of the previous government, and what the other political forces, including the current opposition, can learn from this process as well. I believe what we'll all learn is that We need to realize that eternity is not something which should be applied to the power system or to politicians or to the situation when you are at the power. And we need to realize that time will come when the questions will be asked about everything, about failed policies, when you were sincerely trying to achieve something, but you failed, and you need to answer the questions why it did not work in educational system, in agriculture, in international relations, and so on. And there will be different kind of questions which should be answered, and I want to respond somehow to the question from our colleague from Egypt. What are the lessons? We need to make clear boundaries between certain things. First of all, it's the personalities and the institutions. And the too much personalization of the institutions and of the state system eventually leads to disaster. No matter what kind of personalities they are kind of good kings and empires or bad ones and so on. Because good and bad depends on from where you are looking to those people. Therefore, this depersonalization is a huge task which we have not overcome yet in Georgia. I don't know, it's a matter of our culture, traditions, southern culture, whatever. It's very deeply rooted. And unfortunately, it plays a very negative role. And this is huge task to do that. Second, we need to learn how to influence on the issues without crossing the boundaries of the law. So how to operate within the frames of the law, because what threatens statehood and democracy, and this is the case right now in Georgia, and I believe it will be the case in a decade, 2 or 3 to come, that sometimes policymakers, presidents, prime ministers, parliamentarians, policemen, and so on, they feel too much that the boundaries of the law are not establishing enough room for maneuvering. And their first intention is to move out the boundaries and frontiers, to get more freedom, and then they would be able to serve to their nation in a better way. This is a huge mistake, and we need to learn somehow to be within the frames of the law, and to make influence within the frames of the law and the Constitution. And that's a huge task which we need to do. And the last thing, I believe, we need to learn that time will come and the questions will be asked. Where hundreds of millions went? Why the issues are not investigated? Why people died in kind of questionable circumstances? Why and how this covering such issues was happening? Why and how the intervention in the judiciary and prosecutors' activity and so on happened. The polling, which was frequently mentioned by our colleagues and opponents here, demonstrates one important thing. Media is freer in this country than probably ever. Business community is freer than ever. People are considering that the government is not interfering in their daily life more than ever. Elections were conducted without administrative pressure, which is huge achievement. But are those achievements sustainable? No. And it's not guaranteed that next elections will be like that. The current government needs to work hard in order to achieve that. And the question which Mr. Bokeria raised about effectiveness of the state. Of course, this is an important thing. And whatever we are saying, that the improvements are necessary in the fields of democracy, human rights, freedoms, and so on, should not be done on the expense of the effectiveness of the state. But we are talking about effectiveness of the state which acts within the frames of the law and not within the frames of the political will. Because I believe it is proven again and again by different systems is that communist, I don't know, libertarian, neoconservatives, liberal democratic, whatever systems people were calling to it, but as soon as the attempt was that the power and the will can make change dramatically and in 2 days, these attempts failed. Because state building and the building of the democratic society is much more complex task than to have political will, power, and go and do it. It's going to fail eventually if it is not accompanied by those principles. Thank you.
Yeah, very briefly commenting on some of the points, Mr. President. Yes, when you lose elections, that's the verdict of people to you, but it does not mean that you should disappear or go to jail. And when Republican Party lost elections in the United States, nobody among the Democrats believed that the Republican Party should now disappear. And I guess the same happens in every other democracy. So that's the big and important difference. Yes, you lose elections, you pay your political price because of that, but it does not mean that if you lose elections, you have to disappear at all, or you have to be punished and go to jail. And that's the big difference, and that's exactly the difference we are talking about between Georgia and the democratic countries. And the test to the rule of law is not the question whether the similar allegations can be put to ordinary citizens, but the question whether the government reacts when there are similar allegations against acting members of government. This is the test, not the ordinary citizen. And we see cases when government simply ignores the allegations or facts which are brought by opposition or media by simply saying that it's not serious, we will not comment on that. And this is the most popular comment heard, for example, from our Minister of Interior, that this is not serious, I will not comment on that. And this is the test, because if government is serious about the rule of law, they should take all facts equally seriously, whether it concerns the previous government or whether it concerns the acting government. And that's the test of the rule of law, because nobody says that things should not be investigated. Things should be investigated, but things should be investigated from the past and from the present as well. And that is the important test for the rule of law. And very last point, I mean, Mr. Ilarionov mentioned that Chairman of Parliament is a specific position. Yes, I mean, at the moment, this is the only position where you can see acting and former officials sitting together at the panel. You cannot see it for President, you cannot see it for Prime Minister, for many other ministers, because formers are either arrested or wanted. So this is the only exception where we two can sit together, acting and former. And as far as I follow the current developments, I guess the prosecutor's office will try to fix this deficiency of procedural democracy in the near future. So those of you who are here and attend this session and see two of us sitting together, congratulations. It may be the unique opportunity for you to see the current and former Chairman of Parliament together. Thank you.
I had a very specific question from Mr. Bukeria about, sort of criticized me for somehow equating this last electoral change of power from previous elections, changes of power who happened against some kind of non-constitutional means and upheavals. And I actually said that I certainly recognize it as an very important precedent, and it's not only its power of precedent is very important, and also the fact that after electoral change of power we have greater pluralism, stronger opposition still despite everything in parliament, etc. That's very important. And I think that both previous government deserves tribute for conceding power in elections, and Mr. Ivanishvili deserves tribute for convincing previous oppositioners that existed that you should come to power through elections rather than revolution. I remember we discussed a lot with Mr. Margolashvili as independent experts. So that's extremely important, but what I meant in my short remarks, that I did not want to go very long, that two things. One, that it was, we cannot be sure, we as the Georgian people, that it will become routine procedure from now on. First, because of extraordinary circumstances of one person being so rich and therefore, because of that, so influential. But also that because, although it was formally through elections, but it felt like revolution. Rhetoric of the government was like it was like a revolution, and I spoke about it in my main presentation, and partly practice, like, you know, putting your opponents, treating your opponents as some force that should disappear because it's an ancien regime kind of remnants which don't deserve to exist anymore. This made it similar to previous revolutions. And also about this increased criminality and as an example of eroding, let's say, erosion of state capacity or state efficacy. Okay, yes, as I said, there are general concerns about sustainability. I didn't go into details. There are certain areas in which we have these new problems, although government would not recognize this. I mean, it's obvious increase in criminality, very huge budget deficit. We have kind of continuous, recurring and to some extent systemic violence, street mob violence against opposition sometimes minorities, which police claims it cannot stop and cannot curb. Those are bad things, but what I wanted to say is that still the sum total of these indicators would not allow us to say that we are back to somehow failing state stage. I mean, but we can, as I said, we cannot say accomplished and be calm. And in the end, I want to, I guess we are ending this panel, and I want to end with a joke, of which I was reminded by Mr. Usupashvili's statement that our government increased the importance of a single citizen. I remember a Soviet joke, a Chukcha joke. I know that in Western audiences, ethnic jokes are politically incorrect, but in Soviet Union we had them. At that time, there was this general slogan, everything for a human individual, все для человека. And Chukcha, who was a native of Siberia, goes for the first time to big city, to Moscow, and says, oh, he's very impressed. I saw Kremlin, lots of cars, huge streets, and I also saw that individual for whom everything is. Yeah, and so in Georgia, of course, it's very certain that the importance of single citizen is increased, and we know who that single citizen is.
So I don't think anybody needs to apologize, certainly to our visiting fellows here, for airing your political differences. That's why you come to a country, because you want to learn about some of the emotions and passions and arguments that are taking place. And I think we all profited very much from this. So I'd like to thank all the panelists. We are running considerably behind, so I'm asked that you only take a 10-minute break before we continue with the next session. So thank you all very much.